Section 16 of the Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animals. Chapter 8, Joy, High Spirits, Love, Tender Feelings, Devotion. Part 2. High Spirits, Cheerfulness. A man in high spirits, though he may not actually smile, commonly exhibits some tendency to the retraction of the corners of his mouth. From the excitement of pleasure, the circulation becomes more rapid, the eyes are bright, and the color of the face rises. The brain, being stimulated by the increased flow of blood, reacts on the mental powers. Lively ideas pass still more rapidly through the mind, and the affections are warmed. I heard a child, a little under 4 years old, when asked what was meant by being in good spirits, answer, "It is laughing, talking, and kissing." It would be difficult to give a truer or more practical definition. A man in this state holds his body erect, his head upright, and his eyes open. There is no drooping of the features and no contraction of the eyebrows. On the contrary, the frontal muscle, as Moreau observes, tends to contract slightly, and this smooths the brow, removes every trace of a frown, arches the eyebrows a little, and raises the eyelids. Hence, the Latin phrase exporrigere frontem, to unwrinkle the brow, means to be cheerful or merry. The whole expression of a man in good spirits is exactly the opposite of that of one suffering from sorrow. According to Sir C. Bell, in all the exhilarating emotions, the eyebrows, eyelids, the nostrils, and the angles of the mouth are raised. In the depressing passions, it is the reverse. Under the influence of the latter, the brow is heavy, the eyelids, cheeks, mouth, and whole head droop. The eyes are dull, and the countenance pallid, and the respiration slow. In joy, the face expands. In grief, it lengthens. Whether the principle of antithesis has here come into play in producing these opposite expressions in aid of the direct causes which have been specified and which are sufficiently plain, I will not pretend to say. With all the races of man, the expression of good spirit appears to be the same, and is easily recognized. My informants from various parts of the Old and New Worlds answer in the affirmative to my queries on this head, and they give some particulars with respect to Hindus, Malays, and New Zealanders. The brightness of the eyes of the Australians has struck 4 observers, and the same fact has been noticed with the Hindus, New Zealanders, and the Dyaks of Borneo. Savages sometimes express their satisfaction not only by smiling, but by gestures derived from the pleasure of eating. Thus, Mr. Wedgwood quotes Petherick that the Negroes on the Upper Nile began a general rubbing of their bellies when he displayed his beads, and Leichhardt says that the Australians smack and clap their mouths at the sight of his horses and bullocks, and more especially of his kangaroo dogs. The Greenlanders, when they affirm anything with pleasure, suck down air with a certain sound, and this may be an imitation of the act of swallowing savory food. Laughter is suppressed by the firm contraction of the orbicular muscles of the mouth, which prevents the great zygomatic and other muscles from drawing the lips backwards and upwards. The lower lip is also sometimes held by the teeth, and this gives a roguish expression to the face. As was observed with the blind and deaf Laura Brickman, the great zygomatic muscle is sometimes variable in its course, and I have seen a young woman in whom the depressores anguli ores were brought into strong action in suppressing a smile, but this by no means gave to her countenance a melancholy expression owing to the brightness of her eyes. Laughter is frequently employed in a forced manner to conceal or mask some other state of mind, even anger. We often see persons laughing in order to conceal their shame or shyness. When a person purses up his mouth as if to prevent the possibility of a smile, though there is nothing to excite one or nothing to prevent its free indulgence, an affected, solemn, or pedantic expression is given. But of such hybrid expressions, nothing more need here be said. In the case of derision, a real or pretended smile or laugh is often blended with the expression proper to contempt, and this may pass into angry contempt or scorn. In such cases, the meaning of the laugh or smile is to show the offending person that he excites only amusement. Love, tender feelings. Although the emotion of love, for instance, that of a mother for her infant, is one of the strongest of which the mind is capable, it can hardly be said to have any proper or peculiar means of expression, and this is intelligible, as it has not habitually led to any special line of action. No doubt, as affection is pleasurable sensation, it generally causes a gentle smile and some brightening of the eyes. A strong desire to touch the beloved person is commonly felt, and love is expressed by this means more plainly than by any other. Hence, we long to clasp in our arms those whom we tenderly love. We probably owe this desire to inherited habit in association with the nursing and tending of our children, and with the mutual caresses of lovers. With the lower animals, we see the same principle of pleasure derived from contact in association with love. Dogs and cats manifestly take pleasure in rubbing against their master and mistresses, and in being rubbed or patted by them. Many kinds of monkeys, as I am assured by the keepers in the zoological gardens, delight in fondling and being fondled by each other, and by persons to whom they are attached. Mr. Bartlett has described to me the behavior of two chimpanzees, rather older animals than those generally imported into this country, when they were first brought together. They sat opposite, touching each other with their much protruded lips, and the one put his hand on the shoulder of the other. They then mutually folded each other in their arms. Afterwards they stood up, each with one arm on the shoulder of the other, lifted up their heads, opened their mouths, and yelled with delight. We Europeans are so accustomed to kissing as a mark of affection that it might be thought to be innate in mankind, but this is not the case. Steele was mistaken when he said nature was its author and it began with the first courtship. Jemmy Button, a Fuegian, told me that this practice was unknown in his land. It is equally unknown with the New Zealanders, Tahitians, Papuans, Australians, Somals of Africa, and the Eskimo. But it is so far innate or natural that it apparently depends on pleasure from close contact with a beloved person, and it is replaced with various parts of the world, by the rubbing of noses, as with the New Zealanders and the Laplanders, by the rubbing or patting of the arms, breasts, or stomachs, or by one man striking his own face with the hands or feet of another. Perhaps a practice of blowing, as a mark of affection, on various parts of the body may depend on the same principle. The feelings which are called tender are difficult to analyze. They seem to be compounded of affection, joy, and especially of sympathy. These feelings are in themselves of a pleasurable nature, excepting when pity is too deep or horror is aroused, as in hearing of a tortured man or animal. They are remarkable under our present point of view, from so readily exciting the secretions of tears. Many a father and son have wept on meeting after a long separation, especially if the meeting has been unexpected. No doubt, extreme joy by itself tends to act on the lacrimal glands, but on such occasions as the foregoing vague thoughts of the grief which would have been felt had the father and son never met will probably have passed through their minds, and the grief naturally leads to the secretions of tears. Thus, on the return of Ulysses, Telemachus rose and clung weeping around his father's breast. There the pent grief reigned over them, yearning thus. Thus piteously they wailed in sore unrest, and on their weepings had gone down the day, but that at last Telemachus found words to say. Worsley's translation of the Odyssey, Book 16. So again when Penelope at last recognized her husband, then from her eyelids the quick tears did start, and she ran to him from her place, and threw her arms about his neck, and a warm dew of kisses poured upon him, and thus spake. Book 23. The vivid recollection of our former home or of a long past happy days readily causes the eyes to be suffused with tears, but here again the thought naturally occurs that these days will never return. In such cases, we may be said to sympathize with ourselves in our present, in comparison with our former state. Sympathy with the distresses of others, even with the imaginary distresses of a heroine in a pathetic story for whom we feel no affection, readily excites tears. So does sympathy with the happiness of others, as with that of a lover at last successful after many hard trials in a well-told tale. Sympathy appears to constitute a separate or distinct emotion, and it is especially apt to excite the lacrimal glands. This holds good whether we give or receive sympathy. Every one must have noticed how readily children burst out crying if we pity them for some small hurt. With the melancholic insane, as Dr. Crichton-Browne informs me, a kind word will often plunge them into unrestrained weeping. As soon as we express our pity for the grief of a friend, tears often come into our own eyes. The feeling of sympathy is commonly explained by assuming that when we see or hear of suffering in another, the idea of suffering is called up so vividly in our own minds that we ourselves suffer. But this explanation is hardly sufficient, for it does not account for the intimate alliance between sympathy and affection. We undoubtedly sympathize far more deeply with a beloved than with an indifferent person, and the sympathy of the one gives us far more relief than that of the other. Yet, assuredly, we can sympathize with those for whom we feel no affection. Why suffering, when actually experienced by ourselves, excites weeping has been discussed in a former chapter. With respect to joy, its natural and universal expression is laughter. And with all the races of man, loud laughter leads to the secretions of tears more freely than does any other cause, excepting distress. The suffusion of the eyes with tears, which undoubtedly occurs under great joy, though there is no laughter, can, as it seems to me, be explained through habit and association on the same principles as the effusions of tears from grief, although there is no screaming. Nevertheless, it is not a little remarkable that sympathy with the distresses of others should excite tears more freely than our own distress. And this certainly is the case. Many a man from whose eyes no suffering of his own could wring a tear has shed tears at the sufferings of a beloved friend. It is still more remarkable that sympathy with the happiness or good fortune of those whom we tenderly love should lead to the same result, while a similar happiness felt by ourselves would leave our eyes dry. We should, however, bear in mind that the long-continued habit of restraint, which is so powerful in checking the free flow of tears from bodily pain, has not been brought into play in preventing a moderate effusion of tears in sympathy with the sufferings or happiness of others. Music has a wonderful power, as I have elsewhere attempted to show, of recalling in a vague and indefinite manner those strong emotions which were felt during long past ages, when, as is probable, our early progenitors courted each other by the aid of vocal tones. And as several of our strongest emotions, grief, great joy, love, and sympathy, lead to the free secretions of tears, it is not surprising that music should be apt to cause our eyes to become suffused with tears, especially when we are already softened by any of the tenderer feelings. Music often produces another peculiar effect. We know that every strong sensation, emotion, or excitement, extreme pain, rage, terror, joy, or the passion of love, all have a special tendency to cause the muscles to tremble, and a thrill and slight shiver which runs down the backbone and limbs of many persons when they are powerfully affected by music, seems to bear the same relation to the above trembling of the body, as a slight suffusion of tears from the power of music does to weeping from any strong and real emotion. Devotion, as devotion is in some degree related to affection, though mainly consisting of reverence, often combined with fear. The expression of this state of mind may here be briefly noticed. With some sects, both past and present, religion and love have been strangely combined, and it has been even maintained, lamentable as the fact may be, that the holy kiss of love differs but little from that which a man bestows on a woman, or a woman on a man. Devotion is chiefly expressed by the face being directed towards the heavens, with the eyeballs upturned. Sir C. Bell remarks that, at the approach of sleep, or of a fainting fit, or of death, the pupils are drawn upwards and inwards, and he believes that when we are wrapped in devotional feelings, and outward impressions are unheeded, the eyes are raised by an action neither taught nor acquired, and that this is due to the same cause as in the above cases. That the eyes are upturned during sleep is, as I hear from Professor Donders, certain. With babies, while sucking their mother's breast, this movement of the eyeballs often gives to them an observed appearance of ecstatic delight, and here it may be clearly perceived that a struggle is going on against the position naturally assumed during sleep. But Sir C. Bell's explanation of the fact, which rests on the assumption that certain muscles are more under the control of the will than the others, is, as I hear from Professor Donders, incorrect, as the eyes are often turned up in prayer without the mind being so much absorbed in thought as to approach to the unconsciousness of sleep. The movement is probably a conventional one, the result of the common belief that heaven, the source of divine power to which we pray, is seated above us. A humbling kneeling posture with the hands upturned and palms joined appears to us from long habit a gesture so appropriate to devotion that it might be thought to be innate, but I have not met with any evidence to this effect with the various extra-European races of mankind. During the classical period of Roman history, it does not appear, as I hear from an excellent classic, that the hands were thus joined during prayer. Mr. Rensley Wedgwood has apparently given the true explanation, though this implies that the attitude is one of slavish subjection. When the suppliant kneels and holds up his hands with the palms joined, he represents a captive who proves the completeness of his submission by offering up his hands to be bound by the victor. It is the pictorial representation of a Latin dare manus to signify submission. Hence, it is not probable that either the uplifting of the eyes or the joining of the open hands under the influence of devotional feelings are innate or truly expressive actions. And this could hardly have been expected, for it is very doubtful whether feelings, such as we should now rank as devotional, affected the hearts of men, while they remain during past ages in an uncivilized condition. End of Section 16.
Section 17 of the Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animals. Chapter 9. Reflection, Meditation, Ill Temper, Sulkiness, Determination. The act of frowning. Reflection with an effort, or with the perception of something difficult or disagreeable. Abstracted meditation. Ill temper, moroseness, obstinacy, sulkiness, and pouting. Decision or determination. The firm closure of the mouth. The corrugators, by their contraction, lower the eyebrows and bring them together, producing vertical furrows on the forehead, that is, a frown. Sir C. Bell, who erroneously thought that the corrugator was peculiar to man, ranks it as the most remarkable muscle of the human face. It knits the eyebrows with an energetic effort, which unaccountably, but irresistibly, conveys the idea of mind. Or as he elsewhere says, when the eyebrows are knit, energy of mind is apparent, and there is the mingling of thought and emotion with the savage and brutal rage of the mere animal. There is much truth in these remarks, but hardly the whole truth. Dr. Duchesne has called the corrugator the muscle of reflection, but this name, without some limitation, cannot be considered as quite correct. A man may be absorbed in the deepest thought, and his brow will remain smooth until he encounters some obstacle in his train of reasoning, or is interrupted by some disturbance, and then a frown passes like a shadow over his brow. A half-starved man may think intently how to obtain food, but he probably will not frown unless he encounters, either in thought or action, some difficulty, or finds the food when obtained nauseous. I have noticed that almost everyone instantly frowns if he perceives a strange or bad taste in what he is eating. I asked several persons, without explaining my object, to listen intently to a very gentle tapping sound, the nature and source of which they all perfectly knew, and not one frowned. But a man who joined us, and who could not conceive what we were all doing in profound silence, when asked to listen, frowned much, though not in an ill temper, and said he could not in the least understand what we all wanted. Dr. Peterite, who has published remarks to the same effect, adds that stammerers generally frown in speaking, and that a man in doing even so trifling a thing as pulling on a boot frowns if he finds it too tight. Some persons are such habitual frowners that the mere effort of speaking almost always causes their brows to contract. Men of all races frown when they are in any way perplexed in thought, as I infer from the answers which I have received to my queries, but I framed them badly, confounding absorbed meditation with perplexed reflection. Nevertheless, it is clear that the Australians, Malays, Hindus, and Kafirs of South Africa frown when they are puzzled. Dobertsoffer remarks that the Guaranis of South America on like occasions knit their brows. From these considerations, we may conclude that frowning is not the expression of simple reflection, however profound, or of attention, however close, but of something difficult or displeasing encountered in a train of thought or in action. Deep reflection can, however, seldom be long carried on without some difficulty, so that it will generally be accompanied by a frown. Hence it is that frowning commonly gives to the countenance, as Sir C. Bell remarks, an aspect of intellectual energy. But in order that this effect may be produced, the eyes must be clear and steady, or they may be cast downwards, as often occurs in deep thought. The countenance must not be otherwise disturbed, as in the case of an ill-tempered or peevish man, or of one who shows the effects of prolonged suffering, with dulled eyes and drooping jaw, or who perceives a bad taste in his food, or who finds it difficult to perform some trifling act, such as threading a needle. In these cases a frown may often be seen, but it will be accompanied by some other expression, which will entirely prevent the countenance having an appearance of intellectual energy or of profound thought. We may now inquire how it is that a frown should express the perception of something difficult or disagreeable, either in thought or action. In the same way as naturalists find it advisable to trace the embryological development of an organ in order fully to understand its structure, so with the movements of expression it is advisable to follow as nearly as possible the same plan. The earliest and almost sole expression seen during the first days of infancy, and then often exhibited, is that displayed during the act of screaming, and screaming is excited, both at first and for some afterwards, by every distressing or displeasing sensation and emotion, by hunger, pain, anger, jealousy, fear, etc. At such times the muscles round the eyes are strongly contracted, and this, as I believe, explains to a large extent the act of frowning during the remainder of our lives. I repeatedly observed my own infants, from under the age of 1 week to that of 2 or 3 months, and found that when a screaming fit came on gradually, the first sign was the contraction of the corrugators, which produced a slight frown, quickly followed by the contraction of the other muscles round the eyes. When an infant is uncomfortable or unwell, little frowns, as I record in my notes, may be seen incessantly passing like shadows over its face. These being generally, but not always, followed sooner or later by a crying fit. For instance, I watched for some time a baby, between 7 and 8 weeks old, sucking some milk which was cold and therefore displeasing to him, and a steady little frown was maintained all the time. This was never developed into an actual crying fit, though occasionally every stage of close approach could be observed. As the habit of contracting the brows has been followed by infants during innumerable generations, at the commencement of every crying or screaming fit, it has been firmly associated with the incipient sense of something distressing or disagreeable. Hence, under similar circumstances, it would be apt to be continued during maturity, although never then developed into a crying fit. Screaming or weeping begins to be voluntarily restrained at an early period of life, whereas frowning is hardly ever restrained at any age. It is perhaps worth notice that with children much given to weeping, anything which perplexes their minds, and which would cause most other children merely to frown, readily makes them weep. So with certain classes of the insane, any effort of mind, however slight, which with an habitual frowner would cause a slight frown, leads to their weeping in an unrestrained manner. It is not more surprising that the habit of contracting the brows at the first perception of something distressing, although gained during infancy, should be retained during the rest of our lives, than that many other associated habits acquired at an early age should be permanently retained both by man and the lower animals. For instance, full-grown cats, when feeling warm and comfortable, often retain the habit of alternately protruding their forefeet with extended toes, which habit they practised for a definite purpose whilst suckling their mothers. Another and distinct cause has probably strengthened the habit of frowning whenever the mind is intent on any subject and encounters some difficulty. Vision is the most important of all senses, and during primeval times the closest attention must have been incessantly directed towards distant objects for the sake of obtaining prey and avoiding danger. I remember being struck, whilst travelling in parts of South America, which were dangerous from the presence of Indians, how incessantly, yet as it appeared unconsciously, the half-wild gauchos closely scanned the whole horizon. Now when any one with no covering on his head, as must have been aboriginally the case with mankind, strives to the utmost to distinguish in broad daylight, and especially if the sky is bright, a distant object, he almost invariably contracts his brows to prevent the entrance of too much light, the lower eyelids, cheeks, and upper lip being at the same time raised, so as to lessen the orifice of the eyes. I have purposely asked several persons, young and old, to look, under the above circumstances, at distant objects, making them believe that I only wished to test the power of their vision, and they all behaved in the manner just described. Some of them also put their open flat hands over their eyes to keep out the excess of light. Gratiolet, after making some remarks to nearly the same effect, says, "Ce sont là des attitudes de vision difficiles." He concludes that the muscles round the eyes contract partly for the sake of excluding too much light, which appears to me the more important end, and partly to prevent all rays striking the retina, except those which come directly from the object that is scrutinized. Mr. Bowman, whom I consulted on this point, thinks that the contraction of the surrounding muscles may, in addition, partly sustain the consensual movements of the two eyes, by giving a firmer support while the globes are brought to binocular vision by their own proper muscles. As the effort of viewing with care under a bright light a distant object is both difficult and irksome, and as this effort has been habitually accompanied, during numberless generations, by the contraction of the eyebrows, the habit of frowning will thus have been much strengthened, although it was originally practised during infancy from quite an independent cause, namely as the first step in the protection of the eyes during screaming. There is indeed much analogy, as far as the state of mind is concerned, between intently scrutinizing a distant object, and following out an obscure train of thought, or performing some little and troublesome mechanical work. The belief that the habit of contracting the brows is continued when there is no need whatever to exclude too much light, receives support from the cases formerly alluded to, in which the eyebrows or eyelids are acted on under certain circumstances in a useless manner, from having been similarly used under analogous circumstances for a serviceable purpose. For instance, we voluntarily close our eyes when we do not wish to see any object, and we are apt to close them when we reject a proposition, as if we could not or would not see it, or when we think about something horrible. We raise our eyebrows when we wish to see quickly all around us, and we often do the same when we earnestly desire to remember something, acting as if we endeavored to see it. Abstraction, meditation. When a person is lost in thought, with his mind absent, or, as is sometimes said, when he is in a brown study, he does not frown, but his eyes appear vacant. The lower eyelids are generally raised and wrinkled in the same manner as when a short-sighted person tries to distinguish a distant object, and the upper orbicular muscles are at the same time slightly contracted. The wrinkling of the lower eyelids under these circumstances has been observed with some savages, as by Mr. Dyson Lacy with the Australians of Queensland, and several times by Mr. Geach with the Malays of the interior of Malacca. What the meaning or cause of this action may be cannot at present be explained, but here we have another instance of movement round the eyes in relation to the state of the mind. The vacant expression of the eyes is very peculiar, and at once shows when a man is completely lost in thought. Professor Donders has, with his usual kindness, investigated this subject for me. He has observed others in this condition, and has been himself observed by Professor Engelmann. The eyes are not then fixed on any object, and therefore not, as I have imagined, on some distant object. The lines of vision of the two eyes even often become slightly divergent. The divergence, if the head be held vertically, with the plane of vision horizontal, amounting to an angle of 2 degrees as a maximum. This was ascertained by observing the crossed double image of a distant object. When the head droops forward, as often occurs with a man absorbed in thought, owing to the general relaxation of his muscles, if the plane of vision be still horizontal, the eyes are necessarily a little turned upwards, and then the divergence is as much as 3 degrees, or 3 degrees 5 minutes. If the eyes are turned still more upwards, it amounts to between 6 degrees and 7 degrees. Professor Donders attributes this divergence to the almost complete relaxation of certain muscles of the eyes, which would be apt to follow from the mind being wholly absorbed. The active condition of the muscles of the eyes is that of convergence, and Professor Donders remarks, as bearing on their divergence during a period of complete abstraction, that when one eye becomes blind, it almost always, after a short lapse of time, deviates outwards, for its muscles are no longer used in moving the eyeball inwards for the sake of binocular vision. Perplexed reflection is often accompanied by certain movements or gestures. At such times we commonly raise our hands to our foreheads, mouths, or chins, but we do not act thus, as far as I have seen, when we are quite lost in meditation, and no difficulty is encountered. Plautus, describing in one of his plays a puzzled man, says, "Now look, he has pillared his chin upon his hand." Even so trifling and apparently unmeaning a gesture as the raising of the hand to the face has been observed with some savages. J. Mansell Weale has seen it with the Kaffirs of South Africa, and the native chief Gaika adds that men then sometimes pull their beards. Mr. Washington Matthews, who attended to some of the wildest tribes of Indians in the western regions of the United States, remarks that he has seen them, when concentrating their thoughts, bring their hands, usually the thumb and index finger, in contact with some part of the face, commonly the upper lip. We can understand why the forehead should be pressed or rubbed, as deep thought tries the brain, but why the hand should be raised to the mouth or face is far from clear. Ill temper. We have seen that frowning is the natural expression of some difficulty encountered, or of something disagreeable experienced either in thought or action, and he whose mind is often and readily affected in this way will be apt to be ill-tempered, or slightly angry, or peevish, and will commonly show it by frowning. But a cross-expression, due to a frown, may be counteracted, if the mouth appears sweet, from being habitually drawn into a smile, and the eyes are bright and cheerful. So it will be if the eye is clear and steady, and there is the appearance of earnest reflection. Frowning with some depression, or the corners of the mouth, which is a sign of grief, gives an air of peevishness. If a child frowns much whilst crying, but does not strongly contract in the usual manner the orbicular muscles, a well-marked expression of anger, or even rage, together with misery, is displayed. If the whole frowning brow be drawn much downward by the contraction of the pyramidal muscles of the nose, which produces transverse wrinkles or folds across the base of the nose, the expression becomes one of moroseness. Duchesne believes that the contraction of this muscle, without any frowning, gives the appearance of extreme and aggressive hardness. But I much doubt whether this is a true or natural expression. I have shown Duchesne's photograph of a young man, with his muscles strongly contracted by means of galvanism, to 11 persons, including some artists, and none of them could form an idea what was intended, except one, a girl, who answered correctly, "Surely reserve." When I first looked at this photograph, knowing what was intended, my imagination added, as I believe, what was necessary, namely a frowning brow, and consequently the expression appeared to me true and extremely morose. A firmly closed mouth, in addition to a lowered and frowning brow, gives determination to the expression, or may make it obstinate and sullen. How it comes that the firm closure of the mouth gives the appearance of determination will presently be discussed. An expression of sullen obstinacy has been clearly recognized by my informants in the natives of 6 different regions of Australia. It is well marked, according to Mr. Scott, with the Hindus. It has been recognized with the Malays, Chinese, Kaffirs, Abyssinians, and in a conspicuous degree, according to Dr. Rothrock, with the wild Indians of North America, and according to Mr. D. Forbes, with the Aymara of Bolivia. I have also observed it with the Araucano of southern Chile. Mr. Dyson Lacey remarks that the natives of Australia, when in this frame of mind, sometimes fold their arms across their breasts, an attitude which may be seen with us. A firm determination amounting to obstinacy is, also, sometimes expressed by both shoulders being kept raised, the meaning of which gesture will be explained in the following chapter. With young children, sulkiness is shown by pouting, or, as it is sometimes called, making a snout. When the corners of the mouth are much depressed, the lower lip is a little everted and protruded, and this is likewise called a pout. But the pouting here referred to consists of the protrusion of both lips into a tubular form, sometimes to such an extent as to project as far as the end of the nose, if this be short. Pouting is generally accompanied by frowning, and sometimes by the utterance of a booing or hooing noise. This expression is remarkable, as almost the sole one, as far as I know, which is exhibited much more plainly during childhood, at least with Europeans, than during maturity. There is, however, some tendency to the protrusion of the lips with the adults of all races under the influence of great rage. Some children pout when they are shy, and they can then hardly be called sulky. From inquiries which I have made in several large families, pouting does not seem very common with European children. But it prevails throughout the world, and must be common and strongly marked with most savage races, as it has caught the attention of many observers. It has been noticed in 8 different districts of Australia, and one of my informants remarks how greatly the lips of children are then protruded. 2 observers have seen pouting with the children of Hindus, 3 with those of Kaffirs and Fingos of South Africa, and with the Hottentots, and 2 with the children of the wild Indians of North America. Pouting has also been observed with the Chinese, Abyssinians, Malays of Malacca, Dyaks of Borneo, and often with the New Zealanders. Mr. Mansell Weale informs me that he has seen the lips much protruded, not only with the children of the Kaffirs, but with the adults of both sexes when sulky, and Mr. Stack has sometimes observed the same thing with the men, and very frequently with the women of New Zealand. A trace of the same expression may occasionally be detected, even with adult Europeans. We thus see that the protrusion of the lips, especially with young children, is characteristic of sulkiness throughout the greater part of the world. This movement apparently results from the retention, chiefly during youth, of a primordial habit, or from an occasional reversion to it. Young orangs and chimpanzees protrude their lips to an extraordinary degree, as described in a former chapter, when they are discontented, somewhat angry or sulky; also when they are surprised, a little frightened, and even when slightly pleased. Their mouths are protruded, apparently for the sake of making the various noises proper to these several states of mind, and its shape, as I observed with the chimpanzee, differed slightly when the cry of pleasure and that of anger were uttered. As soon as these animals became enraged, the shape of the mouth wholly changes, and the teeth are exposed. The adult orang when wounded is said to emit a singular cry consisting at first of high notes, which at length deepen into a low roar. While giving out the high note, he thrusts out his lips into a funnel shape, but in uttering the low notes he holds his mouth wide open. With the gorilla, the lower lip is said to be capable of great elongation. If then our semi-human progenitors protruded their lips when sulky or a little angered, in the same manner as do the existing anthropoid apes, it is not an anomalous, though a curious fact, that our children should exhibit, when similarly affected, a trace of the same expression, together with some tendency to utter a noise. For it is not at all unusual for animals to retain, more or less perfectly, during early youth and subsequently to lose, characters which were aboriginally possessed by their adult progenitors, and which are still retained by distinct species, their near relations. Nor is it an anomalous fact that the children of savages should exhibit a stronger tendency to protrude their lips when sulky than the children of civilized Europeans, for the essence of savagery seems to consist in the retention of a primordial condition, and this occasionally holds good even with bodily peculiarities. It may be objected to this view of the origin of pouting, that the anthropoid apes likewise protrude their lips when astonished and even when a little pleased, whilst with us this expression is generally confined to a sulky frame of mind. But we shall see in a future chapter, that with men of various races, surprise does sometimes lead to a slight protrusion of the lips, though great surprise or astonishment is more commonly shown by the mouth being widely opened. As when we smile or laugh we draw back the corners of the mouth, we have lost any tendency to protrude the lips, when pleased, if indeed our early progenitors thus expressed pleasure. A little gesture made by sulky children may here be noticed, namely their showing a cold shoulder. This has a different meaning, as I believe, from the keeping both shoulders raised. A cross child, sitting on its parent's knee, will lift up the near shoulder, then jerk it away, as if from a caress, and afterwards give a backward push with it, as if to push away the offender. I have seen a child, standing at some distance from anyone, clearly express its feelings by raising one shoulder, giving it a little backward movement, and then turning away its whole body. Decision or determination. The firm closure of the mouth tends to give an expression of determination or decision to the countenance. No determined man probably ever had an habitually gaping mouth. Hence also a small and weak lower jaw, which seems to indicate that the mouth is not habitually and firmly closed, is commonly thought to be characteristic of feebleness of character. A prolonged effort of any kind, whether of body or mind, implies previous determination. And if it can be shown that the mouth is generally closed with firmness before and during a great and continued exertion of the muscular system, then, through the principle of association, the mouth would almost certainly be closed as soon as any determined resolution was taken. Now several observers have noticed that a man, in commencing any violent muscular effort, invariably first distends his lungs with air, and then compresses it by the strong contraction of the muscles of the chest, and to effect this the mouth must be firmly closed. Moreover, as soon as the man is compelled to draw breath, he still keeps his chest as much distended as possible. Various causes have been assigned for this manner of acting. Circe Bell maintains that the chest is distended with air and is kept distended at such times in order to give a fixed support to the muscles which are thereto attached. Hence, as he remarks, when two men are engaged in a deadly contest, A terrible silence prevails, broken only by hard, stifled breathing. There is silence, because to expel the air in the utterance of any sound would be to relax the support for the muscles of the arms. If an outcry is heard, supposing the struggle to take place in the dark, we at once know that one of the two has given up in despair. Gratiolet admits that when a man has to struggle with another to his utmost, or has to support a great weight, or to keep for a long time the same forced attitude, it is necessary for him first to make a deep inspiration, and then to cease breathing. But he thinks that Sir C. Bell's explanation is erroneous. He maintains that arrested respiration retards the circulation of the blood, of which I believe there is no doubt, and he adduces some curious evidence from the structure of the lower animals, showing, on the one hand, that a retarded circulation is necessary for prolonged muscular exertion, and on the other hand, that a rapid circulation is necessary for rapid movements. According to this view, when we commence any great exertion, we close our mouths and stop breathing, in order to retard the circulation of the blood. Gratiolet sums up the subject by saying, "C'est là la vraie théorie de l'effort continu." But how far this theory is admitted by other psychologists, I do not know. Dr. Piderit accounts for the firm closure of the mouth during strong muscular exertion on the principle that the influence of the will spreads to other muscles besides those necessarily brought into action in making any particular exertion. And it is natural that the muscles of respiration and of the mouth, from being so habitually used, should be especially liable to be thus acted on. It appears to me that there probably is some truth in this view, for we are apt to press the teeth hard together during violent exertion, and this is not requisite to prevent expiration, whilst the muscles of the chest are strongly contracted. Lastly, when a man has to perform some delicate and difficult operation, not requiring the exertion of any strength, he nevertheless generally closes his mouth and ceases for a time to breathe. But he acts thus in order that the movements of his chest may not disturb those of his arms. A person, for instance, whilst threading a needle, may be seen to compress his lips and either to stop breathing or to breathe as quietly as possible. So it was, as formerly stated, with a young and sick chimpanzee, whilst it amused itself by killing flies with its knuckles, as they buzzed about on the window panes. To perform an action, however trifling, if difficult, implies some amount of previous determination. There appears nothing improbable in all the above assigned causes having come into play in different degrees, either conjointly or separately, on various occasions. The result would be a well-established habit, now perhaps inherited, of firmly closing the mouth at the commencement of and during any violent and prolonged exertion, or any delicate operation. Through the principle of association, there would also be a strong tendency towards the same habit, as soon as the mind had resolved on any particular action or line of conduct, even before there was any bodily exertion, or if none were requisite. The habitual and firm closure of the mouth would thus come to show decision of character, and decision readily passes into obstinacy. End of section 17.
Section 18 of The Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animals. Chapter 10. Hatred and Anger. Hatred. Rage. Effects of on the system. Uncovering of the teeth. Rage in the insane. Anger and indignation, as expressed by the various races of man. Sneering and defiance. The uncovering of the canine tooth on one side of the face. If we have suffered or expect to suffer some wilful injury from a man, or if he is in any way offensive to us, we dislike him, and dislike easily rises into hatred. Such feelings, if experienced in a moderate degree, are not clearly expressed by any movement of the body or features, excepting perhaps by a certain gravity of behavior or by some ill temper. Few individuals, however, can long reflect about a hated person without feeling and exhibiting signs of indignation or rage. But if the offending person be quite insignificant, we experience merely disdain or contempt. If, on the other hand, he is all-powerful, then hatred passes into terror, as when a slave thinks about a cruel master, or a savage about a bloodthirsty malignant deity. Most of our emotions are so closely connected with their expression that they hardly exist if the body remains passive, the nature of the expression depending in chief part on the nature of the actions which have been habitually performed under this particular state of the mind. A man, for instance, may know that his life is in the extremest peril, and may strongly desire to save it. Yet, as Louis XVI said when surrounded by a fierce mob, "Am I afraid? Feel my pulse." So a man may intensely hate another, but until his bodily frame is affected, he cannot be said to be enraged. Rage. I have already had occasion to treat of this emotion in the 3rd chapter, when discussing the direct influence of the excited sensorium on the body, in combination with the effects of habitually associated actions. Rage exhibits itself in the most diversified manner. The heart and circulation are always affected. The face reddens or becomes purple, with the veins on the forehead and neck distended. The reddening of the skin has been observed with the copper-colored Indians of South America, and even, as it is said, on the white cicatrices left by old wounds on negroes. Monkeys also redden from passion. With one of my own infants, under 4 months old, I repeatedly observed that the first symptom of an approaching passion was the rushing of the blood into his bare scalp. On the other hand, the action of the heart is sometimes so much impeded by great rage that the countenance becomes pallid or livid, and not a few men with heart disease have dropped down dead under this powerful emotion. The respiration is likewise affected. The chest heaves and the dilated nostrils quiver. As Tennyson writes, "Sharp breaths of anger puffed her fairy nostrils out." Hence we have such expressions as breathing out vengeance and fuming with anger. The excited brain gives strength to the muscles, and at the same time energy to the will. The body is commonly held erect, ready for instant action, but sometimes it is bent forward towards the offending person, with the limbs more or less rigid. The mouth is generally closed with firmness, showing fixed determination, and the teeth are clenched or ground together. Such gestures as the rising of the arms with the fists clenched, as if to strike the offender, are common. Few men in a great passion, and telling someone to be gone, can resist acting as if they intended to strike or push the man violently away. The desire, indeed, to strike often becomes so intolerably strong that inanimate objects are struck or dashed to the ground, but the gestures frequently become altogether purposeless or frantic. Young children, when in a violent rage, roll on the ground on their backs or bellies, screaming, kicking, scratching, or biting everything within reach. So it is, as I hear from Mr. Scott, with Hindu children, and, as we have seen, with the young of the anthropomorphous apes. But the muscular system is often affected in a wholly different way, for trembling is a frequent consequence of extreme rage. The paralyzed lips then refuse to obey the will, and the voice sticks in the throat, or it is rendered loud, harsh, and discordant. If there be much and rapid speaking, the mouth froths. The hair sometimes bristles, but I shall return to this subject in another chapter, when I treat of the mingled emotions of rage and terror. There is in most cases a strongly marked frown on the forehead, for this follows from the sense of anything displeasing or difficult, together with concentration of mind. But sometimes the brow, instead of being much contracted and lowered, remains smooth, with the glaring eyes kept widely open. The eyes are always bright, or may, as Homer expresses it, glisten with fire. They are sometimes bloodshot, and are said to protrude from their sockets, the result, no doubt, of the head being gorged with blood, as shown by the veins being distended. According to Gratiolet, the pupils are always contracted in rage, and I hear from Dr. Crichton-Browne that this is the case in the fierce delirium of meningitis, but the movements of the iris under the influence of the different emotions is a very obscure subject. Shakespeare sums up the chief characteristics of rage as follows. Quote, "In peace there's nothing so becomes a man as modest stillness and humility. But when the blast of war blows in our ears, then imitate the action of the tiger. Stiffen the sinews, summon up the blood, then lend the eye a terrible aspect. Now set the teeth and stretch the nostril wide. Hold hard the breath, and bend up every spirit to his full height. On, you noblest English." End quote. From Henry IV, Act 3, Scene 1. The lips are sometimes protruded during rage in a manner the meaning of which I do not understand, unless it depends on our descent from some ape-like animal. Instances have been observed, not only with Europeans, but with the Australians and Hindus. The lips, however, are much more commonly retracted, the grinning or clenched teeth being thus exposed. This has been noticed by almost everyone who has written on expression. The appearance is as if the teeth were uncovered, ready for seizing or tearing an enemy, though there may be no intention of acting in this manner. Mr. Dyson Lacy has seen this grinning expression with the Australians when quarrelling, and so has Gaika with the Kaffirs of South America. Dickens, in speaking of an atrocious murderer who had just been caught and was surrounded by a furious mob, describes "the people as jumping up one behind another, snarling with their teeth, and making at him like wild beasts." Everyone who has had much to do with young children must have seen how naturally they take to biting when in a passion. It seems as instinctive in them as in young crocodiles, who snap their little jaws as soon as they emerge from the egg. A grinning expression and the protrusion of the lips appear sometimes to go together. A close observer says that he has seen many instances of intense hatred, which can hardly be distinguished from rage, more or less suppressed, in Orientals, and once in an elderly English woman. In all these cases there was a grin, not a scowl, the lips lengthening, the cheeks settling downwards, the eyes half closed, whilst the brow remained perfectly calm. This retraction of the lips and uncovering of the teeth during paroxysms of rage, as if to bite the offender, is so remarkable, considering how seldom the teeth are used by men in fighting, that I inquired from Dr. J. Crichton-Browne whether the habit was common in the insane whose passions are unbridled. He informs me that he has repeatedly observed it both with the insane and idiotic, and has given me the following illustrations. Shortly before receiving my letter, he witnessed an uncontrollable outbreak of anger and delusive jealousy in an insane lady. At first she vituperated her husband, and whilst doing so foamed at the mouth. Next she approached close to him with compressed lips and a virulent set frown. Then she drew back her lips, especially the corners of the upper lip, and showed her teeth, at the same time aiming a vicious blow at him. A second case is that of an old soldier, who, when he is requested to conform to the rules of the establishment, gives way to discontent, terminating in fury. He commonly begins by asking Dr. Browne whether he is not ashamed to treat him in such a manner. He then swears and blasphemes, paces tip and down, tosses his arms wildly about, and menaces anyone near him. At last, as his exasperation culminates, he rushes up towards Dr. Browne with a peculiar sidelong movement, shaking his doubled fist, and threatening destruction. Then his upper lip may be seen to be raised, especially at the corners, so that his huge canine teeth are exhibited. He hisses forth his curses through his set teeth, and his whole expression assumes the character of extreme ferocity. A similar description is applicable to another man, excepting that he generally foams at the mouth and spits, dancing and jumping about in a strange rapid manner, shrieking out his maledictions in a shrill falsetto voice. Dr. Browne also informs me of the case of an epileptic idiot, incapable of independent movements, and who spends the whole day in playing with some toys. But his temper is morose and easily roused into fierceness. When anyone touches his toys, he slowly raises his head from its habitual downward position and fixes his eyes on the offender with a tardy yet angry scowl. If the annoyance be repeated, he draws back his thick lips and reveals a prominent row of hideous fangs, large canines being especially noticeable, and then makes a quick and cruel clutch with his open hand at the offending person. The rapidity of this clutch, as Dr. Browne remarks, is marvelous in a being ordinarily so torpid that he takes about 15 seconds, when attracted by any noise, to turn his head from one side to the other. If, when thus incensed, a handkerchief, book, or other article be placed into his hands, he drags it to his mouth and bites it. Mr. Nicol has likewise described to me 2 cases of insane patients whose lips are retracted during paroxysms of rage. Dr. Maudsley, after detailing various strange animal-like traits in idiots, asks whether these are not due to the reappearance of primitive instincts, a faint echo from a far distant past, testifying to a kinship which man has almost outgrown. He adds that as every human brain passes, in the course of its development, through the same stages as those occurring in the lower vertebrate animals, and as the brain of an idiot is in an arrested condition, we may presume that it will manifest its most primitive functions, and no higher functions. Dr. Maudsley thinks that the same view may be extended to the brain in its degenerated condition in some insane patients, and asks whence come the savage snarl, the destructive disposition, the obscene language, the wild howl, the offensive habits displayed by some of the insane. Why should a human being, deprived of his reason, ever become so brutal in character, as some do, unless he has the brute nature within him? This question must, as it would appear, be answered in the affirmative. Anger, indignation. These states of the mind differ from rage only in degree, and there is no marked distinction in their characteristic signs. Under moderate anger the action of the heart is a little increased, the color heightened, and the eyes become bright. The respiration is likewise a little hurried, and as all the muscles serving for this function act in association, the wings of the nostrils are somewhat raised to allow of a free indraught of air, and this is a highly characteristic sign of indignation. The mouth is commonly compressed, and there is almost always a frown on the brow. Instead of the frantic gestures of extreme rage, an indignant man unconsciously throws himself into an attitude ready for attacking or striking his enemy, whom he will perhaps scan from head to foot in defiance. He carries his head erect, with his chest well expanded, and the feet planted firmly on the ground. He holds his arms in various positions, with one or both elbows squared, or with the arms rigidly suspended by his sides. With Europeans the fists are commonly clenched. The figures 1 and 2 in Plate 6 are fairly good representations of men simulating indignation. As one may see in a mirror, if he will vividly imagine that he has been insulted and demands an explanation in an angry tone of voice, that he suddenly and unconsciously throws himself into some such attitude. Rage, anger, and indignation are exhibited in nearly the same manner throughout the world, and the following descriptions may be worth giving as evidence of this, and as illustrations of some of the foregoing remarks. There is, however, an exception with respect to clenching the fists, which seems confined chiefly to the men who fight with their fists. With the Australians, only one of my informants has seen the fist clenched. All agree about the body being held erect, and all, with 2 exceptions, state that the brows are heavily contracted. Some of them allude to the firmly compressed mouth, the distended nostrils, and flashing eyes. According to the Reverend Mr. Taplin, rage, with the Australians, is expressed by the lips being protruded, the eyes being widely open, and, in the case of the women, by their dancing about and casting dust into the air. Another observer speaks of the native men, when enraged, throwing their arms wildly about. I have received similar accounts, except as to the clenching of the fists, in regard to the Malays of the Malacca Peninsula, the Abyssinians, and the natives of South Africa. So it is with the Dakota Indians of North America, and, according to Mr. Matthews, they then hold their hands erect, frown, and often stalk away with long strides. Mr. Bridges states that the Fuegians, when enraged, frequently stamp on the ground, walk distractedly about, sometimes cry and grow pale. The Reverend Mr. Stack watched a New Zealand man and woman quarrelling, and made the following entry in his notebook. Eyes dilated, body swayed violently backwards and forwards, head inclined forwards, fists clenched, now thrown behind the body, now directed towards each other's faces. Mr. Swinhoe says that my description agrees with what he has seen of the Chinese, excepting that an angry man generally inclines his body towards his antagonist, and pointing at him, pours forth a volley of abuse. Lastly, with respect to the natives of India, Mr. J. Scott has sent me a full description of their gestures and expression when enraged. The low-caste Bengalese disputed about a loan. At first they were calm, but soon grew furious and poured forth the grossest abuse on each other's relations and progenitors for many generations past. Their gestures were very different from those of Europeans, for though their chests were expanded and shoulders squared, their arms remained rigidly suspended, with the elbows turned inwards and the hands alternately clenched and opened. Their shoulders were often raised high, and then again lowered. They looked fiercely at each other from under their lowered and strongly wrinkled brows, and their protruded lips were firmly closed. They approached each other, with hands and necks stretched forwards, and pushed, scratched, and grasped at each other. This protrusion of the head and body seems a common gesture with the enraged, and I have noticed it with degraded English women whilst quarrelling violently in the streets. In such cases it may be presumed that neither party expects to receive a blow from the other. A Bengalee employed in the Botanic Gardens was accused, in the presence of Mr. Scott, by the native overseer of having stolen a valuable plant. He listened silently and scornfully to the accusation, his attitude erect, chest expanded, mouth closed, lips protruding, eyes firmly set and penetrating. He then defiantly maintained his innocence, with upraised and clenched hands, his head being now pushed forwards, with the eyes widely open and eyebrows raised. Mr. Scott also watched two Mehis in Sikkim quarrelling about their share of payment. They soon got into a furious passion, and then their bodies became less erect, with their heads pushed forwards. They made grimaces at each other, their shoulders were raised, their arms rigidly bent inwards at the elbows, and their hands spasmodically closed, but not properly clenched. They continually approached and retreated from each other, and often raised their arms as if to strike, but their hands were open and no blow was given. Mr. Scott made similar observations of the Lepchas, whom he often saw quarrelling, and he noticed that they kept their arms rigid and almost parallel to their bodies, with the hands pushed somewhat backwards and partially closed, but not clenched. Sneering defiance, uncovering the canine tooth on one side. The expression which I wish here to consider differs but little from that already described, when the lips are retracted and the grinning teeth exposed. The difference consists solely in the upper lip being retracted in such a manner that the canine tooth on one side of the face alone is shown, the face itself being generally a little upturned and half averted from the person causing offence. The other signs of rage are not necessarily present. This expression may occasionally be observed in a person who sneers at or defies another, though there may be no real anger, as when any one is playfully accused of some fault and answers, "I scorn the imputation." The expression is not a common one, but I have seen it exhibited with perfect distinctness by a lady who was being quizzed by another person. It was described by Parsons as long ago as 1746, with an engraving showing the uncovered canine on one side. Mr. Raylander, without my having made any allusion to the subject, asked me whether I had ever noticed this expression, as he had been much struck by it. he has photographed for me, Plate 4, Figure 1, a lady who sometimes unintentionally displays the canine on one side, and who can do so voluntarily with unusual distinctness. The expression of a half-playful sneer graduates into one of great ferocity, when, together with a heavily frowning brow and fierce eye, the canine tooth is exposed. A Bengalee boy was accused before Mr. Scott of some misdeed. The delinquent did not dare to give vent to his wrath in words, but it was plainly shown on his countenance, sometimes by a defiant frown, and sometimes by a thoroughly canine snarl. When this was exhibited, the corner of the lip over the eye tooth, which happened in this case to be large and projecting, was raised on the side of his accuser, a strong frown being still retained on the brow. Sir C. Bell states that the actor Cook could express the most determined hate when with the oblique cast of his eyes he drew up the outer part of the upper lip and discovered a sharp angular tooth. The uncovering of the canine tooth is the result of a double movement. The angle or corner of the mouth is drawn a little backwards, and at the same time a muscle which runs parallel to and near the nose draws up the outer part of the upper lip and exposes the canine on this side of the face. The contraction of this muscle makes a distinct furrow on the cheek and produces strong wrinkles under the eye, especially at its inner corner. The action is the same as that of a snarling dog, and a dog, when pretending to fight, often draws up the lip on one side alone, namely that facing his antagonist. Our word sneer is in fact the same as snarl, which was originally snar, the L being merely an element implying continuance of action. I suspect that we see a trace of this same expression in what is called a derisive or a sardonic smile. The lips are then kept joined or almost joined, but one corner of the mouth is retracted on the side towards the derided person, and this drawing back of the corner is part of a true sneer. Although some persons smile more on one side of their face than on the other, it is not easy to understand why in cases of derision the smile, if a real one, should so commonly be confined to one side. I have also on these occasions noticed a slight twitching of the muscle which draws up the outer part of the upper lip, and this movement, if fully carried out, would have uncovered the canine and would have produced a true sneer. Mr. Bulmer, an Australian missionary in a remote part of Gippsland, says, in answer to my query about the uncovering of the canine on one side, "I find that the natives in snarling at each other speak with the teeth closed, the upper lip drawn to one side, and a general angry expression of face, but they look direct at the person addressed." 3 other observers in Australia, one in Abyssinia and one in China, answer my query on this head in the affirmative, but as the expression is rare, and as they enter into no details, I am afraid of implicitly trusting them. It is, however, by no means improbable that this animal-like expression may be more common with savages than with civilized races. Mr. Geach is an observer who may be fully trusted, and he has observed it on one occasion in a Malay in the interior of Malacca. The Reverend S. O. Gleaney answers, "We have observed this expression with the natives of Ceylon, but not often." Lastly, in North America, Dr. Rothrock has seen it with some wild Indians, and often in a tribe adjoining the Atnas. Although the upper lip is certainly sometimes raised on one side alone in sneering at or defying anyone, I do not know that this is always the case, for the face is commonly half averted, and the expression is often momentary. The movement being confined to one side may not be an essential part of the expression, but may depend on the proper muscles being incapable of movement excepting on one side. I asked 4 persons to endeavor to act voluntarily in this manner. 2 could expose the canine only on the left side, 1 only on the right side, and the 4th on neither side. Nevertheless, it is by no means certain that these same persons, if defying anyone in earnest, would not unconsciously have uncovered their canine tooth on the side, whichever it might be, towards the offender. For we have seen that some persons cannot voluntarily make their eyebrows oblique, yet instantly act in this manner when affected by any real, although most trifling, cause of distress. The power of voluntarily uncovering the canine on one side of the face being thus often wholly lost, indicates that it is a rarely used and almost abortive action. It is indeed a surprising fact that man should possess the power, or should exhibit any tendency to its use, for Mr. Sutton has never noticed the snarling action in our nearest allies, namely, the monkeys in the zoological gardens, and he is positive that the baboons, though furnished with great canines, never act thus, but uncover all their teeth when feeling savage and ready for an attack. Whether the adult anthropomorphous apes, in the males of whom the canines are much larger than in the females, uncover them when prepared to fight, is not known. The expression here considered, whether that of a playful sneer or ferocious snarl, is one of the most curious which occurs in man. It reveals his animal descent, for no one, even if rolling on the ground in a deadly grapple with an enemy and attempting to bite him, would try to use his canine teeth more than his other teeth. We may readily believe from our affinity to the anthropomorphous apes that our male semi-human progenitors possessed great canine teeth, and men are now occasionally born having them of unusually large size, with interspaces in the opposite jaw for their reception. We may further suspect, notwithstanding that we have no support from analogy, that our semi-human progenitors uncovered their canine teeth when prepared for battle, as we still do when feeling ferocious, or when merely sneering at or defying someone, without any intention of making a real attack with our teeth. End of section 18.